Good morning, Sage Creek Bobcats. My name is Darius Rahmanian.
And I'm Jake Nipper.
And welcome to SagePOL, your destination for rational commentary on relevant news.
We have a special guest star today.
It's me, Aydin Erol. I don't know if you've met me before, but I'm Middle Eastern.
You probably know him. You love him. He's a good friend of ours, and he's very educated on the topic of the Middle East, which is going to be what we're going to cover today. The history of the region, why it is the way it is today, current political conflicts, current wars, etc., the divisions between them and their cultures. So I figured this is something not all our students may be educated on, and it could be something that you guys might learn something from. Darius's father is Iranian, and so he knows quite a bit about this as well. And Aydin, both of his parents, I believe, right?
Both
are
they originate.
Yeah,
from
they're first generation immigrants. So he's got plenty of stories and information about the region. I am not that well versed, so I'm going to be learning some things today with you. So let's just get right into it. Let's start with the history. Aydin or Darius, would you guys care to explain what countries we see now in the region and where they came from, where the history of those countries are, and sort of who controls each region and where that sort of division of power came from?
So there is quite a lot of countries in the Middle East, a lot of different ethnicities and religious sects all across. Right now, one of the biggest countries that we see are Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Of course, there are smaller countries such as Lebanon, Yemen, Qatar, and Oman, but they aren't usually in the spotlight as much.
And the UAE, is that a country or is that a group of smaller countries?
I believe it's the United Countries that have a large Arab population or Arab control.
Right, the United Arab Emirates. So, okay, that's interesting. I didn't actually know that. And so, what are the oldest standing countries? Where does the power switch between hands from? And kind of where did it all start with way back when, in the olden days?
So I'll start with this one. A long time ago, in a land very far away, there was the Persian Empire was the very first massive collective empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Asia all the way to the Balkans. And essentially, over time, the Persian Empire would reform and would fall, would re-rise, and most of the nations you see today are fundamentally descendants. Though they are their own ethnic origin, the Persian Empire is what essentially started it all.
So it was kind of like Mesopotamia, and then they fell and became part of the Persian Empire. The Persians ruled most of the region for a while. What time period was this?
So this goes from the BC. The Sassanids were the most recent version of the Persian Empire, other than an empire, rather a kingdom.
And when did the Persian Empire fall?
The Persian Empire fell in the BCs, far beyond, like after the end of the Persian Greek Wars, and all I'm saying is essentially that the Persian Empire is the originator of the Middle Eastern culture and empire. You go to Iraq, Afghanistan, even China. The Persian people, the Iranian people, at least the culture is spread extremely wide all over that area of the world.
So after the Persians left, did people just kind of
They didn't leave.
They stayed.
It dissolved.
Yeah,
It dissolved.
They
always
disassociated
stayed
into like their own regions and their own prospect and that kind
It
of
wasn't.
thing.
It's not like there's one race here, one race here. They've mingled over the hundreds of years.
Of course,
and
like most regions.
And a lot of countries are actually blended with several ethnic races.
So after Persia, people just kind of went into did their own thing, own countries. Were they like kind of smaller?
They were tribes. They were nomadic tribes.
Like the Bedouins and whatnot?
The Bedouins. There's no definable nations other than later on during the rise of Islam, that like the Umayyad Caliphate that gave rise to one of Aydin's favorite nations, the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the beginning of Islam. When was that exactly? Was that in the BCs or was that after?
AC.
It was after.
So
the birth.
I think it was like 500 to 600 in the Common Era. What happened after Muhammad began to teach Islam? Like the Caliphate, you mentioned that.
The Umayyad Caliphate. They were one of the largest beginning caliphates.
So what is a caliphate?
A caliphate is essentially They have a king. They have a caliph who is.
It's a Muslim pope.
It's
So
a,
it's like
Muslim pope.
It's almost like a theocracy, I guess.
Not exactly. Caliphate doesn't always have control over it. For example, the Ottoman Empire, the Caliphate was there to blend the people who were extremely religious with the government.
So it
was like a translator between the government to the religious people.
Could you compare it to the Roman Catholic Church?
I would say a little bit. I'd kind of compare it to the early versions of the Catholic Church that had direct affairs with the burgeoning European kingdoms.
And so that also brings us on to, this is going to be a slight diversion from the chronological history, but let's talk a little bit about Islam and its different sects. So the Caliphate, if I understand correctly, comes from one branch of Islam, and then there's another branch of Islam that rejects the idea of a caliphate. Could someone explain that to me?
Well, the Caliphate in the Ottoman Empire was a Sunni. The Ottomans were Sunni Islam, and Turkey is now a Sunni Islam country. But there are two sects that are the big
denominations.
And those are the Shiites and the Sunnis?
Yes. Shiites usually are more towards the east area in Iraq and Iran. They're most populous in Iran.
And they don't support a caliphate?
They are the main supporters. Because they are the radicals, correct?
Not exactly.
Those are,
in definition, they don't support a caliphate, but I mean, their leader of their country is pretty much a caliphate. He's pretty much a caliphate.
Islamic Republic.
And what about
hypocrisy? They say they don't want a caliphate, but they call it another name, and it's pretty much a caliphate.
So, and the Sunnis on paper do support a caliphate?
Yeah. They did when the caliphate was around.
Okay, so you could sort of roughly compare this to Protestants versus Catholics. For those of you Christian boys, if you want a better understanding of things, that is a rough approximation. Though don't get me wrong, things are very different between the two religions. But so after Islam originated, the two sects branched off, and these nomadic countries that were not exactly
there weren't united.
There weren't any united countries. There weren't any borders, that kind of thing. It was just sort of a region. When did the first country start popping up again and becoming sovereign?
I'll take this one. So right after World War II, the Ottoman Empire, which was now actually Turkey, correct, Aydin?
Yeah, they became Turkey in 1922.
Yeah, after Turkey was formed, Great Britain, a falling empire, divided the Middle East along with its other UN counterparts that had territorial claims in the area into the standing regions we have today. Most notably Iraq, Syria, and others. And especially the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates, which are like Yemen, Lebanon, they were all underneath British control.
So who were sovereign before the night? I believe like Iran was its own country before.
Not exactly. They were under influence from these other countries.
Oh yeah, Iran was the big. They were the most influenced in the area, but they were still their own sovereign nation.
They had their own monarch that was being puppeted.
The Shah.
Yeah.
And the Ottoman Empire, aka Turkey, was also. That was a big presence in the region as well, right?
Yeah, but it fell way before World War II. This was at the end of World War I when they had their sultan exiled and then turned it into a democracy in 1922.
Lovely stuff. Okay, so that was a big leap from the beginning of Islam to founding the first sovereign nations that we know today. Now, these nations after World War II, the empires that controlled them, like the British, they separated them into their own countries because they were losing power for them, right?
It was more of a push towards decolonization, I would say, rather than the fact of losing power. If you ask a British person, they'd probably say it was just decolonization and the end of the empire, rather than just like a full failure of the British colonial system.
And I think most people would view that as a good thing.
When dividing them, it made it easier to influence and control them, rather than a huge amount of land with several ethnic populations being controlled. You had separate governments that you could each refer to that were controlled by, most of the time, people that were the majority race.
So
except for Iraq. Iraq is the...
So I guess it gave each cultural majority their own chance to have their own voice in the region.
Yeah, it just made it so that people wouldn't lash out against having one leader who wouldn't be similar to, say,
who may not represent them.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think when we continue here, this is when the United States begins playing a major role. Between the 50s and 70s, the United States went from a self-sufficient global superpower.
And they were
to,
kind of isolationist.
Yeah.
They wanted to keep to themselves. We wanted to keep to ourselves before World War II. But once
No,
World War
let me
II,
finish. I'm talking post World War II. I'm talking about these rise of these new nations.
Okay.
The main influencer moved from just in general the Great Britain and France to the United States wanting the oil.
once the UN
Once the
became a
UN was
thing.
formed, yeah. And then, Jake, one of your favorite topics we can move on to is Israel and the formation of that.
Favorite. That's I guess it's a hot button topic right now. So in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, or was it the 50s? Sometime in that time.
1947 is when Israel was created.
Yeah.
Okay, so right after World War II, 2 years after the fall of the Axis powers, Israel was recognized as a sovereign state by the UN, and obviously, since the land that Israel occupied was the territory of other countries, land had to be taken away from other countries in order to form.
It wasn't
the land.
territories of other countries. It was just land people were living in.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
It wasn't recognized. This is the time that they're also making other countries such as Syria and Iraq.
Yeah,
So this was in the middle of-
forming their land and
Okay.
forming the borders.
So this was in the middle of dividing up the borders, and they decided to stick Israel in here, which included Jerusalem, which is the Holy Land for both for
Christians,
Jews,
Muslims, and Jews.
Christians and Muslims, exactly. And so, as you can probably tell, that is kind of a recipe for some conflict with the natives of the region, because the people that were living there at the time were
Arabs.
they weren't majority Jewish, and so the UN wished to give the land back to the Jews who had been living there since way before Christ, because that is recognized as the original Holy Land of the Jews. And after the Holocaust, obviously, the world and the UN wanted to give the Jews a government and a homeland that they could call upon to represent them in the international scene. So that's kind of the motivation to create Israel as its own sovereign nation, but that sparks some conflict if everyone wants to talk about that.
1964, closing in on 20 years after the creation of Israel, the Six-Day War occurred, wherein a united group of Arab nations tried to invade Israel and take back the land, wherein the UN and more significantly the United States helped Israel beat back. In 6 days, around five nations, and Israel even gained more land, creating even more conflict and tension in the area.
And so the countries that were fighting against Israel to claim the land as their own, those were Muslim, they were Muslim majority countries, correct?
And but when we say that,
They were more Arab countries than they were Muslim.
Okay.
It's
because
it's a divide.
Yeah.
It's a social and religious divide we have with the Israelis and the Jews.
It's definitely not just religious. It's also political and social, because there were people that were non-Jewish that were forced to leave their homes when Israel was created, because that was their land for a good amount of time. And so those people left. They got pretty mad when they had to leave their own land. And, those people may or may not have been Muslim, but the point to them was that their homes were taken from them. So it wasn't just religious, it was social. That is a good point. I think that's something that needs to be recognized, that it's not just a religious conflict anymore. And so the Six-Day War happened, and Israel beat off all of its enemies with the help of the United Nations and the United States. And what does that bring us to now?
So after that, the entirety of the Middle East went through an identity crisis. More significantly, something that sparked the entire identity crisis itself was the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which my father himself experienced, as he was an official in the Iranian army infrastructure, and he had to escape because the Ayatollah, who had overthrown the Shah, was a theocratic leader who took Sharia law into effect. And Sharia law, for those who don't know, is a part of the Quran where it speaks of oppressing women.
And it's pretty violent.
It's pretty violent. It's not at all compliant with any Western democracies or even our American ideals of equality.
Enlightenment values, human
equality,
rights.
economic equality, gender equality, whatever equality you want. It has nothing to do with that.
Human rights.
Human rights in general. It's a very bad thing. And so in Iran right now, it's very
this
oppressive.
isn't religious hate, first of all. Let's clarify
No,
that.
this is the fact. We're talking about right now is what they say in their holy book. Though we do not have scripture here to properly cite from, trust me, you can look it up for yourself. You can look up videos of Saudis throwing gays off of roofs.
So I just like to preface this with, we don't hate, Islam as a religion or any Muslims. It's just that Sharia law, which many Muslims disagree with, especially the ones that live in the United States, is by nature a pretty violent and scary thing to most Westerners. If you read up on it, a lot of it has to do with like honor killings and there's the genital mutilation of women, and there's homosexual.
These are interpretations,
right?
The book is extremely simplistic with what it has and entails. Nowhere in the Quran does it say you have to abuse women.
Right.
Nowhere does it say you should kill people in the name of your religion. Nowhere in the Quran does it say that women should be covered up and abused.
But that is the tradition.
It's just what you see. I've seen it myself.
With interpretation, and it becomes a norm.
So, anyways, we are not hating on any religion here. We are just kind of trying to explain what's going on and the cultures behind the actions that are being taken in the region. So next, I want to move on to Iran, because Iran is a very
significant. It's a very significant play.
It is one of the most significant nations in the region, and it's got a lot of depth to it. So we got our boy Aydin here.
Okay,
take it away.
So Iran, after World War II, was still under heavy British influence, and for a long amount of time since 1926, it was under a monarchy called Shahs. Shahs were Persian kings. That's their name.
Essentially, they're just kings.
Yeah, they're just kings. And what happened was this is when a lot of attention was starting to go to Iran. In 1953, the new prime minister is going in power, and he sees the distraught with the people. The new prime minister, I don't remember his last name, but his first name was Mohammed. And what he saw was a lot of the oil was being sold underpriced to British, and all that money was going directly towards the Shah and anybody who had government jobs. So people who were peasants or farmers were doing extremely poorly, and there's a large amount of poverty in Iran.
Okay.
After seeing what Muhammad is gaining a lot of strength within the people, and what he believes is he wants Iranian oil to be sold at its proper price and for it to go to all of the people rather than directly the Shah.
Communism.
He was a socialist prime minister, and he saw that
when the entire
starving.
People are in poverty, that's warranted.
Not entire, but somewhere around
it was
almost 50%.
So
50%
I think to always remember about the Middle East is that these nations, Iran is a very good example of a developed one, as well with Saudi Arabia. But Iraq, Afghanistan, their infrastructure, due to extreme violence, extreme decentralization, they're peasants, they're low-earning people, they're not educated, they don't have well-paying jobs, they don't contribute back to national economies.
Yeah. There is a difference between the two categories.
Keep in mind that Iran, these Shahs were extremely secular. They believe that Islam has nothing to do with the government and should be kept away. People didn't have to cover up. It was so advanced that they had movie theaters. It was just like America in Iran at the time.
My dad lived in it. He lived in it.
Yeah, and same
they had everything. They had everything they had.
The point we're trying to make here is that, contrary to what some people think, the region isn't just a land of savages. There was a lot of advancement and technological prowess.
It's always been an area of development, especially with Iran being a forefront in the political and social power of the Middle East.
So what happened with the Shahs? And
not only was the Shah not putting money towards the more poverty, like half of the country. Another thing he was doing, anybody who spoke out, he put under house arrest, and if it got too gnarly, he had them exiled. So people saw the government.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, he didn't kill people, but he had secret police who made sure that everyone
silenced the opposition.
Silenced opposition, and that was a very, very poor choice. And so when this man named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, he's seen as an idol who's gonna take down the tyranny of this king and replace it with something that benefits all people.
And it's not working.
Of course, that's not what happens. From people being put under house arrest and exiled, if you spoke out even a little bit, you are either chopped down in the streets, shot, or hanged by cranes. Ruhollah Khomeini turned Iran from this Western-friendly,
civilized
open,
society,
liberal, very open and
okay,
heavily
Jake,
Western influence
it's still civilized today. It's just they just changed ideology.
It became more autocratic and dictatorship.
Yeah.
No, and extremely heavily influenced by Islam.
Which, I mean, autocratic dictatorships, honestly, I cannot associate with civilization. Like,
oh well, you're wrong because the monarchies are the one. The monarchies are the one that made the autocratic civilizations because colonialism. But like
nowadays, in modern
times,
society,
you don't really associate it because we're so used to Western liberal style values. And when I say liberal, I mean like the classic liberal, not your SJW.
You can say democratic or.
Well, no, I'd say
it was a change in society.
It was a change in society.
It wasn't a change in, they turned into backward savages. They didn't. People were still the same. The government changed.
It's just that the government ruled with an iron fist now.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what happened after the beginning of the 80s?
Well, this was a big shift, mainly because right around this time, this is when the American hostage situation began.
Oh boy.
Since there was this such change in a rejection of Western values, what happened was the American consulate in Tehran, Iran, it was raided by, they say it was students, but at the time it was protesters. And they raided the consulate and they took 6, I believe, Americans hostage.
6 or 7, yeah.
6 or 7 hostages. And this is during Jimmy Carter's presidency. And
worst president.
yeah.
Okay.
He got him home.
Yeah, he's still
So
trash
how?
president. Yeah, continue.
How did he get them home? Was it through force, diplomacy, bribery?
Diplomacy. That's what he did. And to be honest, I'm quite surprised that they actually sent them home because they weren't. It was never in Iran's intent to kill the hostages.
Remind me again why they took hostages.
Because they can. They were angry towards the West. And that was pretty much it.
And so they decided to lash out at the first white people they found.
Not lash out.
No, not white people. More Western people. Yeah.
And
because Middle Easterns.
Yeah, I guess they also.
They're Caucasoids. Yeah.
Yeah.
The hostages were seen as more of a bargaining chip than because that was their way to get the United States' attention.
And to listen.
Yes.
Indeed.
After this, before the hostages get back, there is a failed U.S. mission to send 2 helicopters into Iran for some type of military activity, and it obviously fails. And they are caught in the middle of a sandstorm. And I believe the few American soldiers died.
Yeah.
Due to the helicopter crashing, and the others have to go back.
And this is when they're trying to evacuate the hostages?
They're sending him to do like a military op.
Some kind of military operation.
And so that obviously would create unrest in our country, and we would probably I'd imagine we'd look for an excuse to blame it on Iran.
I mean, America did some pretty bad things to Iran. It got to the point they shot down a passenger plane, a Boeing, I believe, 747.
Yeah.
They shot it down, 260 innocent civilians, and they shot it down and killed them all.
And so,
gotta love war crimes.
And then from there we go into after hostage crisis. For the next, until today, our nation's relations, our United States and Iran, have had a significant decrease in relationships, especially with the Iran nuclear program. But
right.
we're not there yet.
Not yet. We're going chronologically here. So what happens in the Mid-80s?
Well, this is where Saddam Hussein comes into the picture. Iraq hasn't had really any major wars, and it wasn't the Iraq that we know today.
Who was in charge before him?
I believe some other Ba'athist leader, but Saddam Hussein...
Was he secular or religious?
Ba'athists were all about being secular.
Okay.
And that he despised radical religious groups.
Including
and he
Saddam Hussein.
What?
Saddam Hussein as well also despised non-secular government.
Yes. He despised Shiites, and he despised Sharia law.
Okay.
And when he sees this Iran become a religious nation, a theocratic nation, this scares him. Because Iran poses an extreme threat to his government and his power. Not only that, United States, Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia egg him on. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, they egg Saddam Hussein on because they're Sunni Muslims.
So they would want essentially
They
the
want
United
him
States
to turn
was-
it into a Sunni government, and
Right.
United States just wants to get back at Iran for the American hostage.
And so, in our own personal interests, we wanted that war to start, the Iran-Iraq War.
Yes, the Iran-Iraq War. It's a war that lasted somewhere around 7 years and 10 months, and resulted in a lot of people dying and a lot of destruction on both sides. And
Who
it
won?
is today the biggest war fought by two developing nations. And pretty much what happened was a bunch of countries were siding with Iraq. Majority of countries, even United States and Russia sided with Iraq. Two enemies that despised each other for the past 20, 30 years put down their differences to support a common ally.
In order to put down Iran and their theocratical government.
Not really the theocratic government, more as to get back at them.
Okay.
Russia wanted to get back at Iran because Ruhollah Khomeini got rid of the Tudeh party. Tudeh party being the communist Iranian party. And so Iraq is at a serious disadvantage, even with the drone intelligence, drone strikes, missiles, and weapon support from all these nations. They still cannot fight Iran due to their lack of population.
Okay, manpower.
Yes, Iraq is a country of 30 million.
Essentially the same thing
And-
what happened with like Germany and Russia, where Russia just kind of threw people at Germany and Germany fell.
Not exactly. Germany had a lot of men, but we're diverting from the subject.
Well, it's
yeah.
like
At the end of the
kind
war.
of. Well, kind of. But
But it's
this
not
is just
that-
a nation that has less manpower, and Iran had
this
more
is
manpower.
strictly like Iraq is like 1 to 2, less than 1 to 2, and Iran has a population of 80 million, and when faced against it, it became pretty much a state. The first few wars, Iraq was gaining ground. This is because Ruhollah Khomeini killed many of his generals. That means they lack military
Strategy.
know-how.
Right.
And because of that, Iraq actually gets very far into Iran, all the way into a city called Aflaz. But once people see that cities are being attacked and civilians are dying, many who oppose Ruhollah Khomeini still felt that they had to defend their country. And they picked up arms.
Yeah, and
there was
it's-
such a reinsurgence of all these forces attacking Iraq that they had to go back to the border. And once America saw that Iraq has a possibility of losing this war, that's when they start heavily supporting them. And it turns into a stalemate where it's something similar to World War I, where Iran does these massive human wave attacks and pushes through the Iraqi line. Iraqis purposefully move back, say one line,
Yeah.
and then strategically use their mechanized artillery or tanks to take back
Yeah.
the line from the exposed side flanks. So that's pretty much how the war goes until 1988, where Saddam Hussein is tired of this war. And it's just destroying his country at this point, and he's lost already a lot of men. And he wants to make peace with Iran. And he proposes a ceasefire. A strict ceasefire, the war stops. Ruhollah Khomeini denies that. And then Saddam Hussein threatens to gas his people, and then Ruhollah Khomeini says, okay.
That's where you take it too far, Saddam.
No, he had to end the war somehow. And
Right.
that was really his only way.
I feel like that's
the war.
pretty bad foreshadowing of what's to come of Saddam, though.
He was already using chemical weapons against soldiers and some cities, but
Right.
what he meant by this addressment was that he would do it on a massive scale. He would gas several villages, hundreds of cities, and kill probably 500,000 civilian at least. And so the war abruptly ends, and nothing is really gained out of it. Two countries are badly destroyed in the end of it. And this is where the Persian Gulf War starts.
Which is in the late 80s, early 90s?
1991.
Okay.
Only 1991, because the war ends very quickly.
Right.
Kuwait and Qatar originally promised to pay Saddam Hussein to go to war.
Yeah.
And once the war ends, Saddam Hussein asks for this payment.
Just give me my oil, please. And then they're like, haha, whoa, yeah, bro, no.
No.
And they say no. And then this angers Saddam Hussein, and he invades them. The United States sees this as a threat to their oil investments in Kuwait and Qatar, and then declare war on Saddam Hussein.
It doesn't seem like the wisest decision to go to war with multiple countries that are backed by the United States when you couldn't even win a war
Iraq
against
destroyed
Iran.
Yemen and them. He pushed them back.
He burnt several oil fields.
Yeah,
the damage was already done, but he did not think United States would go to the effort that they would fully support these two countries. That's where it came that Saddam Hussein didn't expect.
And that's when the Gulf War kind of happens.
And in 1991, the Papa Bush, this is not the son.
HW.
Yeah. He dismantles the WMD program then, and that's when Iraq hits its lowest point after the Persian Gulf War. Because in a couple of weeks, everything's destroyed.
So who was building weapons of mass destruction?
Supposedly.
Iraq?
They say it was Iraq, but he had already dismantled his chemical weapons in 1991 after Persian Gulf War.
Okay.
And, of course, what tempts Al-Qaeda to do the 9/11 attacks was mainly because of the Persian Gulf War. Because they have this concept of the Westerners that they despise growing on their homeland.
Right.
That is one of the things that anger them the most. And that's what kind of pushed them to do 9/11.
And so, I think I'll take it from here. I love enjoying talking about the American foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East. As we all know, I was talking about 9/11. 9/11 was the most catalyzing event for the 21st century, in my opinion, as it especially came, during the crux, the beginning of the 21st century. The terrorists, Al-Qaeda, from Saudi Arabia or any other general area, they flew 2 jetliners into the World Trade Center, attacked the Pentagon, and luckily some brave souls and some brave Americans stopped another plane from being hijacked and flew it into the ground near Pennsylvania, I do believe.
Yeah, we all know what happened.
And so after that, Americans, as we should have gotten, we got extremely mad, and as we know today, the war on terror did begin. And so, it was the Afghanistan war after that, right?
We went to Afghanistan first.
It was Iraq and
then we went to
Afghanistan
Iraq
at the same time.
But we had no need to go into Iraq. Yeah, a lot of people thought that Al-Qaeda was there. It wasn't. It was Saddam Hussein's regime that was there.
And so what happened?
And what happened? They started yet another war. This wasn't even Al-Qaeda they were fighting. They dismantled this Iraqi government. This angered Iraqi generals, so they started an insurgency fighting United States. This wasn't even Al-Qaeda. Removing Saddam Hussein angered a lot of people.
Yeah.
When was Saddam Hussein removed?
2003.
And so that was as the Iraq and Afghanistan war started?
There's three phases to Iraq war. First phase is against Iraq's Saddam Hussein's military. Mm-hmm. Of course, America is very good at fighting an organized military, so Saddam Hussein's
people claimed it was that we kicked the Vietnam syndrome.
Yeah.
But then we moved into the Afghanistan phase, which is Afghanistan, which had drawn in the Soviets 20 years earlier, and the Soviets had effectively gotten their own Vietnam experience. We started fighting our own battle in Afghanistan.
It's almost like Vietnam all over again. The problem with Afghanistan, my dad served a tour for 8 months out there. He was never, on the front lines. He's an anesthesiologist, so he worked as a physician at a forward operating base. But from what I know, the problem with the conflict out there is that you're not fighting any one enemy. You're fighting dozens and dozens of small cell groups, and these people have no allegiance to a government. So you take out one, and that does nothing to disillusion the other, and they're all fighting you at the same time. And it's essentially you're fighting an ideology and not just a group of people. Because more and more,
it's not even that. You're fighting just people.
Right.
These are people who mingle, who go to bars, who go to the cities to do things.
They're fighting to keep their land sovereign. They're fighting for their very existences. And when you send, good old boys from the U.S. out there to fight a war over something they don't even understand, it's hard to compete with the people that are literally fighting for their very existence and have been doing so, mind you, for literally millennia. Like it's in their culture and their blood to fight for their homeland, and this isn't even. It's not even new to them. This is just almost daily life. Is you get up and you fight off whoever's invading your country now, And so that's kind of what happened when we went into Afghanistan. My dad, he had lots of experience with, dealing with the insurgent groups. He treated plenty of patients that were wounded from them. And there's just, you take out one, and there's another one. And then there's another one, and there's another one. And there's never an end to them because more and more just pop up. And it's under the guise of religion.
Yeah.
And it's people will fight for their homelands no matter what.
Even people who weren't aligned to Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda pushed out this propaganda to convince the people that they're being invaded by West.
Just Western.
When these people weren't heavy radicalist Muslims, they still thought that they were being invaded and were convinced to fight, even though it wasn't that they needed to.
Right.
And what happened was we went into places and we got more and more enemies, kind of like what the Romans did. We got so many enemies it was hard to fight all at once.
And so
that's the
we eventually
same
just
thing
turned the
with,
entire region against us with these wars.
Yeah,
And
that's the same thing with the Taliban.
Whether that first of all, they shouldn't have flown planes in the Twin Towers.
Yeah, we're not. Nobody here is justifying
justifying
9/11.
that. We're saying
9/11 is a terrible event, and it infuriates me when I think about it. The fact that they had the nerve to attack us on our own soil, but at the same time, the way we handled the crisis after that wasn't exactly wise. We went
I agree. I think that we completely had the wrong idea going into it. We were mad, and it was almost a Cold War era move. It felt like to me, looking back on it, having lived through it, those wars, as it was going on, to me, looking back, it just feels like a very Cold War era move. Sending our troops thousands of miles away to fight some menace that is posed by a threat, the government poses as a threat. And now we've come to today. And what is the U.S. doing today? The U.S., we pulled out.
We've got less than 20,000 troops in Afghanistan as we speak. I think it's like 5,000 now.
We're jumping the gun on here. Saddam Hussein was not a good guy, but removing him allowed for more problems to happen in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a secular Ba'athist, and he hated these little radicalist mullah fighters. And
so he kept them at bay in his country.
He made sure to keep them off his streets, okay? And because of that, there were no real Al-Qaeda. Maybe they were hiding in Iraq, but they weren't openly out, and they didn't openly occupy territory. Nothing like that. But once Saddam Hussein's regime was gone, these groups started popping up. Al-Qaeda became much stronger in Iraq.
There was nobody to fight them.
And then Taliban got angry at the United States by going in. And
everyone's just getting mad. Everyone. That's
we
madness. Everyone's getting mad. There's just
we created our own. We created our own war by pissing off everybody in the region. So when Saddam Hussein wasn't there to quell the uprisings of religious radical groups, like Aydin said, that's when we went and we destabilized the region. Then we left, and then we created our own enemy. And less than a decade later, we had to come back in to fight them again, which is when my dad was there. He was there from I think 2006 to 2007. In the middle of those years, and the enemies that he and his comrades fought were the ones that we created just 5-6 years before then by destabilizing the region. So that was probably the worst way to handle things. We didn't ever implement a democratic government or a government in general to control the region.
We trained the forces there. We trained the security forces in Iraq, and then some of them turned against us, taking their training and weapons with them. It's a very serious problem that we created, and did we create it ourselves? And today, are we trying to remedy the mistake we made with the trillions of dollars we are spending in our defense budget? I do believe so. There's definitely been progress made in the Middle East. Is it stable? Far from over. The Syrian civil war is obviously a very good example of that.
And if you guys don't know, that's part of essentially the whole ISIS conflict. Essentially, after the conflict in like the 2008, 2009, that kind of time frame, obviously we never actually fully pulled out of the region until recently, but we slowly started to begin to halt our involvement in Afghanistan and controlling the Taliban. It was just kind of our time to leave. Public support of the conflict started to grow extremely thin because we had no reason to be in there anymore. Everybody, had kind of settled down after 9/11. We had no
after we got Osama bin Laden, a lot of people didn't see a purpose in being there.
That too, and I remember that day. That was in the 5th grade, I think. Anyways, so then, we get to now, and we have ISIS, but ISIS is pretty much already eradicated. But what happened with ISIS?
Not exactly. They are still in Syria.
The Iraq conflict is over.
Yeah, they drove them out of Iraq.
Right.
But Syria, what happened was ISIS formed not mainly in Iraq because of Saddam Hussein's absence, his no longer being there. And I forgot the term for this, but all of these Middle Eastern countries having revolutions, that also caused it.
Arab Spring, right?
Yeah, I think that, was it Arab Spring?
It might have been, but
Okay.
then,
But what caused it, is all these people are revolting. Egypt, the guy steps down. Libya, Gaddafi is killed.
yeah.
Syria, Americans don't want to support the Free Syrian Army because they're afraid of what's going to happen in Libya again. They don't
Right.
want to support the rebels and then have the whole government torn apart.
Because we've seen this happen
What they
before.
want to do is replace Bashar al-Assad with a secular guy.
Yeah.
They didn't want to tear apart the whole government. And because of that, they didn't support the rebels. And after time, this Free Syrian Army started to get different ideas and started to split apart into different factions. Instead of being one Free Syrian Army, it became the West Syrian Army, East Syrian Army. And they started fighting amongst each other. And it became like factions where each little...
There are like over
Each
16
group-
different groups
Yeah.
fighting in the region, or at least there
Some
were
love
a
Americans,
year
some
ago.
hate Americans.
Yeah.
But after this time, their whole anger towards Bashar kind of,
Settles down.
settled down.
So, for any of you guys that don't know, Bashar al-Assad is currently the dictator of Syria, and he isn't exactly the best person in the world. He's not...
he nerve gassed an entire village and then we hit Syria with 59 Tomahawk missiles.
Yeah, that's something that was that definitely
he
changed
used to
public
be a
opinion on
doctor
him.
in London. And when his dad dies, they ask him to take over in Syria, and he reluctantly accepts. But he's a Ba'athist too. He's secular, so that means he doesn't believe in them, religion being anywhere near...
It's not a religious game for him. It's more of just a power play.
It's just like Saddam Hussein. He wants to just stay in power.
Right.
And ISIS being there kind of helped. Because that took all the pressure off of him and put it on ISIS.
Yeah.
And ISIS formed because Syria was so weak and because mainly the regime didn't want to eradicate ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
Because Bashar al-Assad was very smart about it. He saw ISIS as a tool to prolong.
It took the media and the West's attention off of his exploits in the region, and we all unified against ISIS, the common enemy.
Yes.
And so the enemy of my enemy essentially became, enemy of their enemy, which is us, and Assad is they. So Assad's enemy of their enemy, which is us, became our friend. That was a really, really bad way of saying it. But essentially...
You get the point.
It's sort of like America and Russia unifying to eradicate the Third Reich in World War II. But we have absolutely nothing in common besides that. So
They weren't friendly with ISIS. They were more as, you're here, we need you, we're not going to completely eradicate you.
Yeah.
And that was the mindset. And because of that, ISIS spread from Syria all the way around to Iraq. And then once people saw that Syria, after a lot of these attacks that ISIS was doing, a lot of people saw that ISIS was a threat. And then that's in Iraq. They organized the military and they drove them out of Iraq. But they still are in small amounts in Syria.
And that was pretty recently that they finally eradicated them from Iraq. They liberated their self-proclaimed capital of, what was it, Raqqa?
Raqqa.
Yeah. And so until like 2016, ISIS was a growing threat. We started, the entire world kind of worked together to quell them right then and there. Russia was supporting Assad's regime and giving them weapons and even men to help.
Men.
Not men?
No. Just sometimes the occasional air support that they tucked under the rug.
Yeah. Which we've all heard about. And then we were obviously, we had coalition forces with the UN in the region to fight ISIS. But the things got a little complicated once Assad decided to nerve gas his own villages. So a village got hit by a nerve agent.
Not villages, cities. Where he knows Free Syrian Army positions are, he does not feel like putting out men to actually clear room, building by building. So the more effective but dark way of doing it is just by gassing the whole city.
Right, and so he's
killing one fighter per 10 innocent people.
And that is if you're at all well versed in human rights, that's essentially not a good thing. Western society does not stand for the killing of innocent civilians. So what happened after that was Donald Trump got a little riled up, and then so did the rest of America, and we sent 60 Tomahawk missiles out there, and started basically barraging certain locations where we knew Assad's regime was. Did we attack Assad or did we attack ISIS?
We attacked both.
Yeah, but we attacked ISIS way more than we did Assad.
Yeah.
Mainly because we saw ISIS as a bigger threat. And I'm going to divert our attention to Kurds. And a lot of attention has been brought towards the Kurds.
They exist in Turkey, correct?
They exist in several nations. They're
northern. They mainly just
southeastern Turkey, northwest Iran, a little bit of
Syria.
Northeast Syria, and then northeast of Iraq.
Who's that one faction in Turkey that's against the government? The PKK. Yeah, is that Kurds?
Yes.
Yes.
There's several Kurdish factions that are connected to each other, but being under one faction allows them. Being in separate factions allows them to support each other without being all targeted. Because if PKK was the only Kurdish faction, then Turkey would have the right to go into Iraq to wipe them out.
So who are the Kurds and what are they essentially all for and against?
Kurds are a very large population. There are 80 million of them. And they all range in what they want. Minority wants their own country and are willing to fight and die for it. Majority don't. Mainly, if you ask any Kurd in northeast or southeast of Turkey, they would not want a Kurdish country. Mainly because they are filthy, stinking rich. And if being under a different government would mean they won't have the other abilities and opportunities that Turkey gives them. It's only a very small portion that want their own country and are either resorting to terrorism or insurgency.
And I'm assuming it's like the lower class.
Not always, but in a lot of cases, yes.
Okay.
But a lot of attention has been brought to Kurds ever since they became a proto-state in northeast Iraq, and ever since they've been kicked out of Kirkuk. Kirkuk was a originally Turkish, majority Turkish city in north of Iraq. And I believe it's an oil city also that has oil fields nearby it. And this is out of the Kurds' boundary of where they are allowed to occupy in Iraq. And they pretty much start burning records to claim that it's majority Kurdish population so that they can take Kirkuk too. Iraq sees this and they invade Kirkuk to kick out the Kurdish forces. And they are successful because Kurdish forces are in total 200,000 men with only AKs. Mm-hmm. And when a force of 150,000 men attacks a city of maybe 3,000 or 4,000 fighters, they haltush.
Right.
Because Iraq has Apache helicopters, M1 Abrams tanks. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, where are the Kurds now?
They're still there. They're everywhere.
And
they're in a lot of they're a big population, and it's only a minority that really wants their own country.
Okay, so what about I think this is the last topic I want to cover here. In Turkey, the current, I guess would you call him a dictator or a president?
Well, you would have to have a very closed mindset to call him a dictator.
Okay, so let's discuss the current leader of Turkey. I forget the name of this guy, but
his name's Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
Okay, so recently, Mr. Erdogan, or however you say that. I'm sorry, I'm extremely white.
But you're black.
With what I understand from international news that I've heard over the last year or so, the president of Turkey wishes to pass a constitutional, essentially referendum that will give the executive branch, so him, pretty much the majority of power in decision making, so that he can finish fighting these insurgent groups like the PKK.
PKK. The power that he's giving towards himself is for military action.
Right.
It is not in the way of that he can repeal laws, he can strip people's rights away.
Okay.
And what the media does is they want to portray him as not as good as he is.
Okay.
People say that he's a dictator. He was democratically elected by popular vote of the country, 52%.
Okay.
And you think that is a small portion. Keep in mind, Donald Trump was elected with 49% of the popular vote. Currently, what he wants to do is keep damage control.
So you could you can compare this, I think, to the way the Roman Empire did it with I know everybody knows this, Caesar. When the Roman Republic, before it became an empire, was in a time of war, they would essentially defer all decision-making power to
a dictator,
one quote unquote dictator, until the time of war was over. And so Julius Caesar essentially took this, and then when wartime was over, he just casually forgot to give up all this power that he inherited.
Well, see,
and
you're kind of wrong there. Every dictator before Julius Caesar always gave the power back to the people. That was such a cool and essential thing about the Roman Republic.
We're straying off a little.
Yeah.
I'm just making an analogy here. But and then afterwards he didn't give back the power, and the Roman Republic became an empire. So that's kind of where I think some people in the West view this, is that if the Turkish president were to be given this kind of majority vote power, then
even in referendums, people vote to say yes, you can have more power, or no, you can't.
Right.
And they are passed because people, after seeing what happened with the coup, they don't want stuff like that happening again. And believing that if he has more control over the military, he can stop things like that with his orders that he gives.
So essentially keep the peace.
Keep the peace, yes. And when you also hear the media say that he is jailing journalists. They like to twist words in the favor that they want to put it. If you call journalists people who put up, whether it be articles online or newspapers, they're jailed because they are inciting hatred or violence against the government.
So it's libelous against the country.
Yes.
Okay.
They are saying pick up arms and fight for the Kurds, or Erdogan is a tyrannical leader, he is a bull.
Blah, blah, blah.
And, from
because
the
of that,
Western perspective, you would say, oh, well, that's freedom of speech. But keep in mind,
freedom of press.
This is a different culture, this is a different country, there are different rights.
Yes.
And especially, I can see why this kind of thing would not be the most favorable for everybody, and that's because inciting a rebellion would destabilize the region and could cause more violence.
The Supreme Court also decided in our country that
example.
Let me finish. We keep using the United States as a base example for the Western society. The Supreme Court ruled, I forgot in which ruling, but they definitely did rule that newspapers can publish things about a current war, right? As long as they've already happened and do not give away possibilities like troop movements, correct?
Okay.
So if the New York Times, for example, says the U.S. to attack Guatemala, right? 2 days before we attack Guatemala,
that could ruin everything.
That's libellous, and the New York Times would be jailed or fined extremely, or be
that kind of loosely plays into this, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's
just an example.
That could be another angle of where you could look at it. And so I think this is a pretty multifaceted issue. But in the end, if the Turkish president was democratically elected and the referendum is democratically voted upon, I see no reason in having to intervene in such things.
Yeah. And keep in mind that the only thing that worries me is who comes next. With that power still being in place after his 7-year term is done, what if the next guy's a nutcase? Those are questions we ask ourselves. But generally, when people elect somebody, they don't elect somebody who's out of it.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully.
We'll see what happens.
But,
anyways,
yeah.
We're kind of coming to the end here.
So what's your final view for the Middle East? Where do you see in the next 20 years, 20, 50 years?
It's still going to be extremely destabilized for the next 20 years.
But I don't
see any end to the theocratic regime that's in Iran.
That's just kind of
I don't see any I doubt there will be anything, because many of the people who really oppose Khomeini left and came to America or Canada.
I think
Europe.
Western involvement's pretty much quelled for now, though, because right now
he's asking in general,
Yeah.
not the West's
No, yeah,
involvement.
this is just my perspective because I'm mostly versed in the West's involvement in the region. Right now, I think we have our priorities set on Kim Jong Un's regime in North Korea and the East, because that's kind of the boiling kettle, so to speak. So we're kind of done with the Middle East for now. Obama pulled out most of our troops, and Donald Trump isn't doing anything to act against that, because it'd just be foolish not to. We have no reason to be in the region anymore for ourselves, and we, obviously
it's definitely an end of an era. It's the end of the Middle Eastern conflicts for now, at least
For us.
Our major involvement, and
It'll still be on the news for many years to come.
For many years to come. A couple weeks ago, ISIS bombed a temple in Cairo, killing over 300 people. Yeah, that's still extremely relevant. It's just that for us Americans, especially for our generation, who might have to fight these future wars,
I don't think we got anything to worry about for now.
Yeah, it's an end of an era. It's definitely, there's going to be definite shifts in the way things are going to be done.
Yeah, this is a productive episode, and I think I learned a lot. I hope you guys learned as much as I did, if not a little more. And I really want to thank Aydin for coming on. He's a very knowledgeable guy, and I don't know what we would have said on this episode without him.
Yeah,
I'm happy to be here, and I'm very grateful to talk with you guys.
I'm Darius Rahmanian.
Jake Nipper.
And I'm Aydin Erol.
It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you guys in the next one.